Now, much of what I'm going to show comes from an analysis of satellite image. A satellite image-based time series of kelp canopy area. So I just want to take a moment to describe the data set. It's pretty easy to observe kelp from the air or from space even. It's pretty distinct, like giant kelp, bull kelp, these canopy forming kelps create this floating canopy that's really, easy to distinguish from water. So it looks brown or reddish brown to the naked eye. If you have a sensor that can pick up near-infrared reflectance, it looks even brighter. So that figure on the right is a satellite, it's a core satellite image. We've colored the near-infrared reflectance green. And so even from this, from space, you can really pick out the kelp canopy pretty easily. So there's a long history of remote sensing of kelp. These methods have been around for decades. A challenge is, so if you have an image, yeah, you can see the kelp on it. I think a challenge is creating a long-term standardized data set, right? That you can use to accurately track changes over months to years to decades, something that's automatable and consistent. And that's where a lot of my research lies. So we've used Landsat satellite imagery, which is this fantastic data set that's managed by NASA and the USGS. This is a series of satellites that have been collecting imagery continuously across the world from the early 1980s. And so it provides global coverage. You get an image now every 16 days. And so you can start to get pretty high temporal resolution. With cloud cover and other image availability issues, we really can be assured of a clear image every couple months. And so we've created a seasonal time series from this data set just to make sure that we have at least one to a few good observations that we can average for each season. So we've created seasonal coverage from 1984 to the present. It's continuously being updated. Currently, we have data from the southern range limit of giant kelp in central Baja up through Oregon. So it covers both species of large canopy forming kelps, bull kelp and giant kelp. Fantastic data. It's freely available to the public. So really useful from a scientific perspective. We've developed some automated machine learning approaches to identifying kelp canopy from the Landsat imagery. I'm not going to go into details here, but I'll point you to some references, and I'm happy to talk afterwards with anyone who's interested in the methodological details. We validated our data, our estimates using diver surveys of canopy area and biomass, and then a variety of high resolution imagery. So aerial photos, UAV imagery. So it's well validated. Well validated. I want to be clear about some of the limitations. So Landsat has a 30-meter resolution. So it's great in that we have basically global coverage going back decades, but each pixel is 30 meters by 30 meters. So we may miss small, sparse canopy really close to the coastline. This is really useful for moderate to large sized beds. We're only getting floating canopy, so we're not seeing subsurface kelp. So we're not able to use this for subsurface kelp or other seagrass systems that are covered by water. These types of approaches have been used for seagrass in other parts of the world where water is very clear, but that's a limiting factor. And then we can use this to map a variety of canopy forming species, so giant kelp, bull kelp, but we can't just differentiate between the species. So we're creating maps of kelp canopy. We can't, in areas where there's a mix of giant kelp and bull kelp, we can't distinguish between those two species. All right, so now I'm going to try to do a live demonstration. We'll see how this goes. This is always a risky idea, right? Just to show this tool that we've developed to share this data. And so the tool is called KelpWatch. Here we go. I'll give you the URL in a bit, but here's the landing page. If you click on the methodology, this provides some references and a little bit more detail about those automated classification algorithms that I mentioned earlier. Then if you go on the map, you can zoom into your favorite kelp forest. So I did my PhD work at UC Santa Barbara, so we'll zoom in and take a look at kelp in Santa Barbara. Come on. Let me try this again. Bear with me here. There we go. There we go. Okay. So the just for the what we're showing here is extent of kelp as mapped by Landsat at different different time periods. And so we're starting at Q2 of 1984. So this is spring of 1984. The I'll go on the legend here. This the shaded area is the administrative kelp beds. This is just the way the California Department of Fish and Wildlife manage kelp forests. So if you're not interested in kind of management units, we can just turn that off. The gray footprint here is basically kelp habitats. This is anywhere where we observed kelp at some point during the time series, during this 36-year time series. So this is what we think is potential area where kelp can be. And then the greens and blues show current canopy area at this time point. So again, spring of 1984 right now, and we can press forward and watch it change. Now that you notice that there was one period where everything was white. So this white areas are basically no data. It's areas where during that period cloud cover covered the area, so we didn't have any observations. There was a little bit less data availability due to downlink capabilities early in the time series. So there's a little bit more cloud cover early in the time series. By the mid to late 1990s, essentially we have an observation every quarter. So now we're taking a look at how kelp is changing through time, and then the greener colors are a higher density for a given area. So you can see periods of or fluctuations. You can just see how rapidly kelp varies through time. Periods of high abundance, periods of low abundance, and how quickly that changes. If you zoom up, the big El Nino 1997-98 had a big negative impact in kelp, and you can see 98 here, basically a total loss of kelp. But it was pretty short-lived, and by 1999 we have recovery here. Another cool feature of this data set is you can find an area of interest. So let's look at this Isla Vista kelp forest off of UCSB, and then this will show a time series. So this is showing a time series of kelp area for this box of interest, as well as the percent coverage of kelp within our box of interest over the entire time series. And so we can download this as a CSV again for your particular bed. If you have some study at some site and you're trying to document how kelp has varied at that site, you can visualize it here, download the actual data with this tool. And again, there's a number of interesting features that we can look at here. One thing that I think is kind of interesting. There's this artificial kelp forest off of San Clemente that has been funded and by SoCal Edison due to kelp loss from the San Onofre nuclear power plant. And so you can see at the beginning of this time series, there's essentially no kelp here. You can see some of the experimental beds that went in the early 2000s. And I mean, you can see how artificial looking they are. Essentially, there was this series of different blocks which were getting different treatments to look at how the different treatments impacted the ability of this artificial reef to succeed. And so this is kind of the initial footprint, the experimental footprint of the reef. You can see these different blocks. And then in I think 2009, 2010, they filled in this whole area with artificial substrates. You can see this new bed kind of pop in here in 2009. So a lot of kind of cool local patterns can be depicted using this data set. So again, I encourage everyone to go play around with this. Take a look at how kelp is changing in your favorite bed. You can find this at kelp.codefornature.org. Again, supported by the Nature Conservancy. Right now, we have the state of California. Plans are to expand this to Baja, up through the Pacific Northwest, and then into Alaska in the near term. So now I'm going to show some regional data extracted from KelpWatch. Here, just to give an idea of regional trends, I've separated our study area into 4 regions: Baja California, Southern, Central, and Northern California. This is a time series of kelp canopy areas summed across each region. And I think, a take-home message is that there's tons of variability. Kelp is highly dynamic, much more dynamic than most terrestrial forests or terrestrial ecosystems for that matter. It makes it hard to identify long-term trends, amongst all of this variability. We'll step through each region and just say a bit about each region. In Baja California, it appears that there was this increase in kelp, from the late 90s into the early mid 2000s, right? Kelp was relatively low from the beginning of the time series through the big 97, 98 El Nino, and then kind of a step function. And again, a lot of variability. There was a sharp decline in 2016. We think that was associated with the marine heat wave, but then regional recovery by 2019. Southern California, a lot of variability on a variety of time scales. There's seasonal cycles, but the seasonal cycles vary. They change from year to year. There's annual variability from year to year. Kelp is very different. And then what appears to be this longer period, 15 to 20 year cycle that we think is linked to some of these oceanographic climate cycles, like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the North Pacific Gyre Oscillation. No clear long-term trend. So at least on a regional scale, Southern California has been relatively resilient to previous disturbances. I wouldn't say that kelp is declining in Southern California, at least over this time period, right, from 1984 to 2020. There might be a different story if we look back to the early 1900s, say. But again, it highlights the high variability of kelp and how that makes trend detection difficult. Central California has a much stronger seasonal cycle, so there tends to be kelp gets wiped out every winter with these big wave events, and then the waters are relatively cool and nutrient rich, a lot of upwelling here, and so kelp recovers during the spring. Less year-to-year variability than we've seen in Southern California, and again, no real clear long-term trend. And in Northern California, those previous 3 regions were dominated by giant kelp. This area is dominated by bull kelp. Again, a pretty strong seasonal cycle. The bull kelp is an annual species, so each year, the individuals die, and then the area is recolonized. More year-to-year variability than we saw in Central California, and this is one area where you could argue that there's a negative trend, really driven by this dramatic collapse in kelp abundance starting 2014, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But kelp really declined dramatically. It hasn't recovered. This is a real area of concern. This is, again, all 4 regions. You can see El Ninos are typically associated with reduced kelp abundance in all regions. The big El Nino in 1997-98 led to widespread loss of kelp. But kelp in all 4 of these regions was pretty resilient. It recovered very quickly, especially in Northern and Central California, but in Southern and Baja California as well. Then this most recent heat wave, the blob plus El Nino, we saw Central California had a little bit of a delayed response, not an immediate impact. Kelp was depressed in Southern and Baja California, but again, some resilience, some recovery there, but a real lack of recovery in Northern California. This is just showing the same data, but now I've instead of choosing 4 large regions, I've separated into smaller quarter-degree latitudinal bins. The bright colors are higher higher canopy area, and you can see in general more canopy, larger beds, more dense canopy in Central and Southern California than Northern California. That's largely driven by the bathymetry and bottom type. Those Northern California beds tend to be more narrow. There's a steeper drop off with depth, and also bill kelp tends to be a little sparser on our imagery than giant kelp. Here I've normalized it by each bin by the fraction of maximum area during the time series, just so we can visualize trends within each bin a little bit easier. And again, you can see this kind of dark footprint, thumbprint of the 97, 98 El Nino here, especially in central and southern and Baja California. And then the more recent heat wave, again, central and parts of Southern California were surprisingly resilient, I'd say. Whereas Northern California, this little section here, and parts of southern, the southern end of the range in Baja California were really negatively impacted. So we'll take with the next 10, 15 minutes, I'll take a closer look at these two areas that did appear to be strongly impacted by that heat wave. So first, we're going to take a closer look at Baja. In order to examine the response across Baja and Southern California, we separated our study area into 100-kilometer coastline segments. So now we're zooming in on Southern and Baja California. We're still looking at regional scales, right? 100-kilometer segments are still large areas, but it gives us a latitudinal gradient near the southern range limit of kelp. We can test this hypothesis that these heating events are more likely to impact populations that are kind of on the edge of their heat tolerance or temperature tolerance, right? The range limit populations. And so we created a seasonal time series for each coastline segment. This is the time series for the Ensenada segment. We've identified a baseline period. This is the 5 years before the heat wave, shown in blue. The heat wave is shown in red here, and then this recovery period shown in black. And then we created these metrics: resistance, which was the proportion of canopy area during the heat wave as compared to the baseline. So it just shows, was canopy area below or above the baseline during the heat wave? And then similarly for resilience, how the canopy recovered. Was canopy area below or above or at the baseline in the years following the heat wave? This area shown in black. And so here are some representative coastline segments. There's a couple take-home messages here. For one, if you look at these top three panels, right? Look at the kelp biomass during the heat wave, the red period, and then the following the recovery period in black. You can see kind of a delayed effect. Like there's this spike, this increase in biomass during the heat wave in red. So kelp didn't immediately kind of decline during the heat wave. It was only towards the end of the heat wave where you see kelp dropping and staying at below average levels. Then in Santa Barbara, in some of these northern segments, there was actually pretty quick recovery, right? A year or two after the heat wave ended, we're back up to typical levels. San Diego had a delayed recovery. It was, for a few years after the heat wave, kelp was at very low levels, whereas Ensenada recovered kind of more similar to Santa Barbara. It came back kind of quick. Now, if we look at the three southern segments that I've identified here, the heat wave was a lot more immediate, like towards the range edge, right? There was this decline in kelp abundance at the beginning of the heat wave, and then kelp was basically at very low levels throughout the heat wave and in the years following the heat wave. One exception is this one really interesting exception is this area, Bahia Tortugas, which is close to the southern range limit of kelp. It was definitely negatively impacted by the heat wave, but had a pretty strong recovery. And 2 years after the heat wave, was back at pre-heat wave levels, even though we're really close to the range limit. And so, this is indicating that this area is potentially a refuge from these heating events. This is showing the same data. I'll go through this kind of quick because it's showing the same data, same thing. It's just for all segments rather than the selection that I showed earlier. And so this x-axis here is the proportion relative to the baseline. So if you're below 1, you're lower than baseline. If you're above 1, you're higher than baseline. And essentially what you can do if you let your eyes move from 14-15 to 15-16 to 16-17, you can see this, shift to the left, basically this widespread decline in kelp relative to the baseline across these years. In many of these segments, the minimums occurred in 2016, 2017. So again, kind of a delayed response. The year after the heat wave is when we saw the lowest levels. And then this variable recovery with in 2017-18 with Pihia tortugas really standing out and having similar levels of relative recovery to the Santa Barbara. This is just a video that some of my collaborators from Ensenada took at that Pihia tortuga site. You can see this was about a year after the heat wave. You can see this pretty dense forest in the subsurface. When the camera pans up, you can see that the canopy is gone. So the heating caused a loss of canopy. The kelp isn't reaching the surface, so it's actually not being detected by Landsat right now. But the forest didn't fully die out, and so that's why I think this area showed such a strong recovery, is because when conditions got a bit better, there was a quick growth to the surface, and then very quickly it was visible by Landsat again, and we saw recovery. So this is a really special and interesting site that again is kind of a climate refuge, I think. We compared the spatial patterns in response and recovery to sea surface temperature metrics, and basically found that maximum monthly, like the sea surface temperature, the warmest month, so maximum monthly sea surface temperature did a pretty good job of explaining patterns in the initial impact. So you can see all areas were below the baseline, but if you crossed like a 23 degree or 23 degree Celsius threshold, you really had almost complete loss of kelp. So we think there's some threshold around between 23 and 24 that's associated with just we're beyond the tolerance capacity of kelp. In contrast, these metrics, sea surface temperature after the heat wave, didn't really do a good job of explaining recovery. And so we think recovery resilience is likely affected by other processes, a variety of things, biotic interactions, things like urchin grazing, competition, and so on. So just to summarize, we had a prolonged loss of kelp near the southern range limit. So yes, the heat wave did have a stronger impact near the southern range limit of kelp, in these warmer regions, these areas that are warmer to begin with. But there were important and interesting local areas of resilience. And then in contrast, relatively strong recovery in northern Baja and many parts of Southern California. Okay, let's end by talking about what the situation in Northern California, which, as I mentioned, is really concerning. We've seen a dramatic loss of bull kelp in Northern California in the last 5 to 7 years. It's gotten a lot of press. It's had big impacts on both commercial and recreational fisheries. It's linked to the closure of the recreational abalone fishery in 2018, which is, that closure has recently been extended, I think, to 2026, maybe. That recreational fishery is estimated at $44 million per year. So it's had a big impact on local economics here. It's also, this loss of kelp has also impacted the commercial urchin fishery. And we've seen, I've showed with Landsat this decline. This McPherson et al. Paper uses a similar data set to show the collapse. This Rogers, Bennett, and Catton paper use a series of higher resolution imagery to show the dramatic decline. Essentially, we saw this big decline in 2014 and a lack of recovery even to date. It appears that this is due to multiple stressors. So there's the heat wave for one, so some potentially negative impacts of temperature or nutrient limitation. Around the same time, or a few years before the heat wave, there was this sea star wasting disease that was spreading through the area and causing a loss of essentially all the sunflower stars, which are a primary urchin predator. And so that's shown in pink here, this decline from 2006 to 2013 of the sunflower stars. Essentially, they were all gone by 2014, 2015. That then was associated with a explosion in the population of purple sea urchins, which are a big grazer of kelp. So the sunflower stars are the big predators of urchins, Once those urchins were released from predation, their populations exploded and they started grazing the kelp and kept it from recovering. So that's the cause. Now, although kelp was decimated, kelp was there was this dramatic loss. There were some areas of resilience. So areas where small beds were actually able to persist throughout the decline. And you can see that in this figure here. So we're currently working on trying to understand where these refugia are and what factors enabled their persistence. I think that they're going to play a big role in the regional recovery of bull kelp once conditions improve. They're going to be the source of spores, basically, to almost reseed the other suitable habitat, once urchin populations go down. And so this work is really being led by my grad student, Kate. She's using the high resolution imagery to map kelp canopy at much higher resolutions, at 3 meters rather than 30 meters. And that's because these refugia are small, they're sparse, they may not be able to all be detected with Landsat. And so she's extending the work we're doing with Landsat with this high resolution imagery. I won't get into the imaging processing details here. Again, I'm happy to talk about that later, or I can refer you to Kate. But essentially, there's a number of steps that we need to do to automate this kelp identification. This imagery is a little bit harder to deal with than Landsat. But essentially, we have this. She's developed this classifier that's mostly automated to, again, take an image, a high resolution image, and turn it into a map of kelp. Her approach has been validated with aerial surveys conducted by the state. And these aerial surveys go back to late 1990s. They're semi-regular surveys where they fly a plane along the coast and create maps of kelp canopy at high resolution. They stopped these surveys in 2016, and so this is where I think this planet satellite imagery can be really valuable, can come in and kind of serve as a way to continue this valuable data set. So here I've pasted our planet time series on top of the state data set. You can see again this dramatic decline in 2014. Kelp has remained at low levels. It hasn't recovered. We do see, I guess, we see a small, it reached minimum 2019. So it actually reached a minimum a few years after the end of the heat wave, as urchins continue to expand. We have seen some small signs of recovery in 2020, at least a slight increase between 2019 and 2020, but kelp is still at historically low levels. And this is just a figure that shows for a couple selected areas of our state area. You can see the historical footprint of kelp in gray, and then green is the areas that were observed in each of these years. So you can see, a small fraction of the suitable habitat is colonized. You can see really low levels in 2019, and then the beginnings of some increases in 2020. And what we're doing, this is very preliminary, but what Kate's doing is trying to identify some of the characteristics of these refugia, of these areas that were able to persist, these areas that were green in all of these images, and comparing the characteristics in terms of depth and slope, distance to river mouths, distance to the edge of a kelp forest. And what preliminary results indicate is that these refugia, these areas that persisted, tend to be in shallower areas. They tend to be a little bit closer to river mouths. So if you look at this bottom left-hand panel, the yellow shows the distribution of the refugia. The blue purple shows the distribution of habitat, basically of kind of normal kelp distributions in this region. And so you can see that the kelp refugia tend to be in shallower depth range. They're clustered close to river mouths. We think that freshwater might have a negative impact on sea urchins, and so that could explain this river mouth effect, where it kind of shelters the kelp from urchins due to a negative impact of freshwater. And then they tend to be in the center of habitat patches, so towards the higher distance to the edge of the bed. So these like kind of central areas of the patch tend to be a little bit more likely to be refugia. So to summarize this section, dramatic loss in kelp, this hasn't been observed at least over the last 40 years. So it is striking. There are some small scale refugia, which tend to be in shallower areas closer to river mouths. I think they're going to be important to the recovery of kelp in this region. And some potential signs of hope. There's some recovery observed in 2020. We're still at historically low levels, but there's hope that once urchin populations fall to more normal levels, that kelp will be able to recover. And then just to summarize the talk, on large scales, if we think about the state of kelp in California, on larger scales, for much of central and southern California and northern Baja, there is a lot of variability, but no clear discernible trends. So I wouldn't say that kelp in Southern California has declined over the last few decades. It has shown a high amount of resilience to these climate disturbances. There's the concern that these shifts, these declines in kelp can be very sudden, and we've seen that in Northern California, right? We've seen a dramatic loss of kelp with little recovery. So while there's no long-term trend in Southern and Central California, Northern Baja, while these areas have shown resilience, I think we need to work to maintain that resilience and try to identify thresholds that are associated with the ecosystem switching states. And then focusing in on that 2014-2016 heat wave, the areas most impacted were the southern range limit of giant kelp in central Baja, and then this section of Northern California. And we're working to try to better understand the drivers, why those areas were so hard hit. And just to speak to that last point, in Northern California, Southern Oregon didn't experience the dramatic declines that the coast of Mendocino and Sonoma counties did. And then Monterey didn't experience the declines that Sonoma and Mendocino. So there's some other stressors, I think, in Sonoma and Mendocino that have caused this shift. And so we're working to better understand that. So that is all I have. Pass it back to you, Sophia, if there's any questions. I think I can, let me see if I can pull up the